Welcome back to another episode of the Black Minutes Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Weaver, and I'm here with my other host.
Nate Bird, happy to be on the podcast as always.
Yes, happy day. And we have a wonderful guest here. My friend Sheryl is here with us today. Sheryl, say hey to everybody.
Everybody.
Yes. So I'm super excited for our episode today. But before we get into asking Sheryl questions about her wonderful life, I'm going to throw it back to Nate for the minutes moment.
All right, here we go. So today, as promised, we talked last week about like medicine and Black people in the field of medicine, and I mentioned that I would do uh, a minutes moment on Henrietta Lacks because I think that she's someone that's very important that obviously doesn't get talked about the way that she should. So we're going to talk about Henrietta Lacks today. Henrietta Lacks was born in Loretta Pleasant on August 1st, 1920. She was an African American mother of five whose cancer cells are the source of the HeLa cell line, the first immortalized human cell line. And it's also one of the most important cell lines in medical research, which is because an immortalized cell line reproduces indefinitely under specific conditions. And it continues to be just like invaluable to medical data around the world. I'll kind of go more into that. Um, but before I do, I want to kind of just talk a little bit about Henrietta herself because we talk about what happened to her, but not so much who she was as a person. So she was remembered as having hazel eyes, a small waist, size 6 shoes, and always wearing red nail polish and a neatly pleated skirt. There's only like I think like one or two pictures of her known, and so if you look online, you can find those. But she was when she was 4 years old in 1924. Her mother died while giving birth to her 10th child. And so, because her father was unable to care for all 10 children after his wife died, he moved the family to Virginia, and then the children were distributed among like family members. And Henrietta ended up living with her maternal grandparents, and she worked on their tobacco farm and she also went to school, but she ended up dropping out of school in the 6th grade so that she could get a full-time job and then help support her family. When she was 21, she married David Lacks and then moved to Maryland, where she gave birth to 4 children. Her last child was born 4 months before she was diagnosed with cervical cancer, and she gave birth to her children at Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins was the only hospital in the area that treated Black patients, but it wasn't for benevolent reasons. It was because they performed experiments on them and did things that would today be considered very unethical, but for the time were considered pretty mainstream. So Henrietta's cells, when she went in to get treated for cervical cancer, her cells were taken without her consent, and then they were used for research. Cell biologists found that her cells could be kept alive and doubled every 24 hours, which is pretty unusual. Cells generally die within a few days and they don't replicate the same way, but Henrietta's cells are very, very unique in that way. And so her cells were actually the first human cells to be successfully cloned in 1953. And since that time, her cells have been used for research into cancer, AIDS, the effects of radiation and toxic substances, gene mapping, and countless other pursuits. By 2009, more than 60,000 scientific articles have been published about the research done on HeLa, which is just the first 2 letters of Henrietta and the last 2 letters, or the first 2 letters of Lacks, so HeLa or Henrietta Lacks. And so over 60,000 articles have been published about research done on HeLa, and that number increased steadily at a rate of about 300 papers each month. Her cells were used to test the first polio vaccine, and they have other uses in virology, including vaccines for HPV, mumps, HIV, herpes, and measles. In the 80s, a scientist who linked HPV to cervical cancer using her cells won a Nobel Prize and then developed vaccines that decreased the death rate for cervical cancer by about 70%. Her cells have been used to make advancements in cancer research and treatment, and they were used to develop a method of counting chromosomes. And actually, using her cells, scientists discovered that the human body only has 23 pairs of chromosomes instead of 24 pairs, which was very significant for doing research with patients with Down syndrome, because the amount of chromosomes is essential to learning about Down syndrome. And then also her cells were used to create gene mapping technology that led to the Human Genome Project, which is basically how they're basically like tracking back the history of humankind. So the way that they're mapping out the human genome, figuring out where we came from. They're using Henrietta Lacks's cells to do that. And also, her cells were sent to space in a Russian Sputnik shuttle to study the effects of zero gravity on living tissue. And it was discovered that her cells actually divided more rapidly while in zero gravity. So the cells were harvested from her body in February of 1951, and then she died from cervical cancer in October of 1951. And neither she or her family were made known of the use of her cells. And it was actually kept from them until about 1975, so almost 25 years later. And they were never compensated for the use of her cells. And then those cells have been shared all over the world, and it's pretty hard to find like a major scientific laboratory that doesn't have a sample of Henrietta Lacks's cells. And so, yeah, it's Henrietta Lacks and her I guess or non-consensual contribution to human advancement and human development in biology for the last 70 years. That's Henrietta.
Wow. That the whole time you were talking, my jaw was dropping because I'm like, wow, her cells are involved in so many things and have been so many places, and they've done a lot of good, but that was not like she did not consent to that. And it's like, how do we, I don't know, like it brings into question like how do we as a society like handle that? Like how do we pay her back? How do we, I don't know. I don't know the answers, and I'm gonna think about this week, but that is a very I don't think I realized the depth to where like the impact of what her cells have done for the medical community and so many medical advancements. And yeah, something needs to be done to honor her. I hope somebody's working on that because she needs to be honored in some capacity, or I don't even know if compensation is the right thing. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, what is the right way to have restitution in this situation?
Yeah, and I mean it's terrible, and like hers is it's one that's well documented, I guess. Johns Hopkins has been known for doing a lot of shady stuff like that. Um, they did like some experiments on black teenage boys and things like that, and then you've got other things that you've heard about. I don't think this was Johns Hopkins, but there's like the Tuskegee experiment, which is where they experimented on black men with different diseases and
Yeah,
infected
I think it was syphilis.
yeah, things like that, and then also we talk about the slave trade, or I guess the slave trade is taught in such a romanticized way. What they don't talk about is how a lot of the medical knowledge that we have today came from studying slaves without their consent. They would perform live surgeries without anesthesia and all these kinds of things because they believed that black people experience pain differently or experience less pain because they were less human. And so these things have been common in America since its inception. It was kind of frustrating reading this and doing the research for it because the sources that I used made sure to point out, oh, this was the standard practice at the time to not ask for consent or to take things without asking. And it's like, it doesn't matter if that was the standard practice at the time. That's not okay, And I don't think I haven't heard of anyone else that this happened to, but I feel as though if it had been someone of another race, their consent would have been asked for because we can speculate or whatever, but the trends show and the history of America shows that this woman was taken advantage of specifically because she was a black woman.
Yeah.
I doubt that she received the treatment that she needed either. But
Yeah.
Thoughts on that, either of you?
Add it to the list.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I watched an interesting movie about her. And I remember when I was watching it and, at the end, like there's so much buildup. And then at the end, it's essentially like her family never received compensation, all these things. And so like you are sitting with it right now, Rachel, I've had years to sit with it. And I think the most frustrating part is that like it's happened, it's done, but we're still not learning about her. Right.
Yeah.
And I'm married to someone whose science was his degree, his major. And we talk about the Gila like a lot and how it's an integral part of science.
Yeah.
Yet that part is missing in the history and our learning.
Wow.
Yeah. And this is just the one that we know about. There's no telling what other advancements have been made, or what other things have been stolen or replicated
Mm-hmm.
that aren't as well documented as this one. And this is because this was a very prestigious medical university or medical school. So yeah, that's Henrietta Lacks.
Well,
Well,
thank you.
I want to watch that movie, Cheryl. So you'll have to send that to me, the name of
Yes,
it, because I
yes.
want to watch it now.
Yep. It was definitely eye-opening. But again, you're very much how you're sitting with it right now, and I've sat with it for years. It's still like, what can be done? Like, how should this play out? It's still, there's a lot of questions still. So
Yeah, if the thought of it for me is just, I don't know, like losing a parent recently, I just am very like more protective over certain things now, if that makes
yes,
sense. Like
yes,
having that experience. And so for me, the thought of it is like quite like that I don't know what I would do. You know what I mean? Like just thinking like someone's here and gone, and their memory is obviously with their family members, but like parts of their body are being used for who knows what. And I don't care if it's for
worldwide.
good.
Yeah,
I don't care if it's for good. Like that's good for you, but you didn't ask
ask.
if you could do that.
Right.
And they did not consent to
No.
anything. So I would be very pissed off. And so I can just only imagine how her family must feel. Just, with someone, it's one thing if they're alive. I don't know. It's all a mess, but I just think that would not sit well with the grief process for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is another thought that I just had, kind of random, but you know how like a lot of times now in like MAGA Republican culture or in prepper culture, doomsday culture, they're always afraid of like government interference or like people experimenting on them, or doing these kinds of things, and they like cite all these different reasons. But the reality is that this kind of thing has been happening to Black people for hundreds of years, and like nothing has been done about it. But then there's like people inventing these ideas of how they think that the universe works, and it's just not the case, but like at the same time denying the reality of things like this. It's pretty bizarre.
Well, on to happier things, I guess. Everyone can
Hmm.
marinate on that. But we'll get into talking to Cheryl about her experiences in her life. And so before we start asking you questions, though, I just want you to like introduce yourself to the people, share like where you're from, and just a little bit about who you are.
Cool. Hey, everybody. I am Sheryl Ellsworth. I was born in Washington, D.C., but I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. Um, I did my undergraduate degree at Brigham Young University, where I studied communications and did a minor in sociology. Um, my minor in sociology got me thinking about, the different problems of the world, and kind of led me into teaching, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit. But I was a school teacher in Washington, D.C. I taught at the then lowest performing elementary school in the District of Columbia. Um, and we were able to be the first school to exit out of school turnaround. We made a lot of national news. Our school was talked about in books. It's kind of crazy to think that I was
Wow.
part of that big movement. But I began to be a school teacher because I was part of a program called Teach for America. I was in the DC metro region. After teaching for 7 years, I found myself back in Utah, a place that I thought I'd never go back to, but I did. And I worked at the Utah State Board of Education, and I worked with schools all around the state. I always say I feel like I know Utah better than any other state that I've ever lived in, because I traveled all around the state helping schools, generally low performing schools, better engage families. You could see a block between school relationships and families, and schools that better engage families, kids did better. And so I think a lot of times the school system always thinks it's the family's fault, but I was there to kind of give the education system a flipped look at it and say, like, what barriers are we putting up that make families feel like they don't belong here and be here to advocate for their kids. after working at the State Board of Education for 5 years, I did a project through the United Way of Salt Lake, where I was able to conduct focus groups with about 200 students from high school to higher ed, specifically BIPOC students, Black, Indigenous, people of color. I was able to hold these focus groups to find out if these students felt represented in business, politics, and education in the state of Utah. And the reason why I picked those three specific things, I was part of a fellowship through Harvard where we looked at our city and what could change, and we recognized as a team that those are three areas that really can make change. And if we want to diversify the voices in those spaces, do our youth that are coming up through these pipelines feel represented, that they want to run for politics, become educators, become business leaders? And we, as a family, just last year relocated to the Metro Atlanta area, and I am an full-time at-home mom of 3 kids, a 4-year-old, a 2.5-year-old, and a 9-month-old. So that's a little bit about me.
Fun. I love her kids. They're so cute. I live on her stories every day. I'm like, heart, 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 because they're just so cute.
I'm just this lonely woman, just me and my kids, just so Rachel, I always appreciate the
love. So love the introduction. Thank you. So as we kind of want I want you to walk us through kind of what was your path to BYU and why you chose to attend BYU of maybe other schools if you have the option, or if you didn't apply, just because I know how LDS folks are sometimes with only applying to BYU.
So I grew up in an area where college was pushed from middle school. I remember getting my first B in 8th grade and thought I wasn't going to get into college. I grew up in a predominantly white community in Richmond, Virginia. My mom always was really, she's an immigrant to the United States. She was from Haiti. And for her, I don't think she was looking at demographics or teacher representation. She was always looking for the best schools. And we'll talk about education, because now who knew that I was going to become an educator and what that means. But for us at that time, it ended up being these schools that were predominantly white, right? And in these spaces, college was just part of almost everyone's trajectory where I came from. And around the time I was a junior in high school, I went to a church camp called Especially for Youth. I had never been out west, but I went to, it was called Rick's College at the time. Today it's BYU Idaho. And I was there, and I recognized that BYU Idaho was not going to be a good space for me. I felt like it was way too strict. I felt like I would not do well there. And I remember being like, oh, and I visited Provo just for a day after I got off my flight or whatever. And I remember thinking okay, I have all these church leaders. I lived in an area that had a lot of dental school students, and a lot of their wives were my leaders, and they all were like, oh, you go to BYU, that's what you do. So I was trying to see what this BYU thing was that everyone was talking about. And I just remember BYU Idaho, which is probably a great fit for a lot of people, but it wasn't going to be a great fit for me. I just was like, I don't think this is a good fit. And I think BYU is going to be a better fit for me. And so I did a lot of LDS kids do. I just applied to the whole package of BYU Idaho, and BYU Hawaii, and got into BYU, gratefully, because again, looking back, I just really don't think BYU Idaho would have worked for me. I really, really don't. Maybe Hawaii would have, but I ended up going to BYU.
Okay. That's cool. And so what was your experience like at BYU? When you first got there, what were your initial impressions? And then over time, how did those change or stay the same? What was your overall experience going through?
Yeah. So I always tell people that when I left my undergrad from BYU, I loved BYU. Even though I had some really, really difficult experiences. But I remember there are two very important, like, distinctive, like, stories that stick out in my mind. The first is when my mom came. We flew out together. I was the first person in my family to go to college. And even though I grew up in a very, very predominantly white community, Richmond, Virginia is still, there's lots of Black people everywhere, right? So just because my school didn't represent that, I saw myself everywhere. And I came to this school and I didn't see myself anywhere. Actually, I remember for a day and a half. And I was walking out of the student center, the bookstore, and I remember my mom and I saw our first Black student. And I won't say her name, but anyway, so we saw and we like all stopped. I was just so happy. I never had that experience before where I didn't know that I was Black like that, right? Like I feel like sometimes, and I think this happens to people who serve LDS missions, they might not even know, like, for example, specifically a white person, they might not know that they're white until they're the only person who's white. And I'm not saying that I didn't know I was Black, but I didn't realize, wow, like how different I felt until I saw this other student. The other thing that happened, there was a point where during freshman orientation, freshmen went one way, parents went another. And the president at the time of BYU, my mom was just like kind of in the parent meeting. She's like kind of sad, right? Like her baby's in a couple days, she's going to go on a plane all the way back to Virginia. And she's like, okay, we're separating. And she's about to leave the meeting. And my mom said that the president of BYU, literally all these parents were coming up to him to shake his hand. And it's almost like he like moved people out of the way to come and shake my mom's hand, to be like, thank you. I know that this is a sacrifice for you to be here. Like he knew, he was aware, like he's aware that there were like 240 Black students out of 35,000 students, and that my mom was coming to bring me here and leave her baby at this school, and what that would mean for her as a Black parent to do so. I've always appreciated that moment from that particular president so much that later down the road, he was able to be the person who married my husband and I. Anyway, so yeah, those are two experiences I had as an undergrad that really stuck out. But sorry, it's a really long answer. Hopefully you guys can.
Oh, it's okay.
No, yeah, you're good. You're good.
But yes, so I quickly learned that BYU was a great place academically. Like I was pushed. There were going to be lots of opportunities for internships, for just networking after. I mean, I would come home for summers, and you know, people were like, oh, she goes to BYU. And after I graduated BYU, people were like, oh, she went to BYU. Like it has a really great name. So academically, great. Where it got super, super tricky, and I think it's because BYU is a church religious school, and I think any religious school feels very similar. Judaism, you know, other Christian sect schools, where marriage is really pushed, right? And I remember my freshman year, all of my friends, all of my girlfriends were just always asked out, and I just wasn't. And I remember sitting in my dorm room one time just like crying, because I was like, I am alone, and this is college, and this should be fun. And it was a very lonely experience for me. I experienced fetishism, where these young men would come home from their missions and, you know, like, were so excited that they served people who were predominantly Black. They see me and they're like, oh yes, this person I want to be with, but not really. Yeah. And that was not awesome, because there would be guys that I'd really like, and I thought they liked me, but they just wanted to kiss a Black girl or check off a list. And then on the flip side, I I always say that the Black experience is very different for males and females at BYU. Like, it's not like there was a long line of Black men wanting to date me either. And so that was hard because it was like, who do I date? I just want to like date and get married like my roommates are doing, because that's what you do. And I had a lot of lonely experiences in that realm. And I remember there's one experience where, one kid told me that, hey, I can't marry you because my dad said that it would be a bad business idea if I married a Black girl.
Wow.
I remember another time where.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but could you
Yes.
explain what he meant by bad business idea? Like, what did he mean by bad business idea?
At the moment, Nate, I didn't ask him more. Like, I was just more like so shocked because we'd been going out and kissing, right, for like a little bit now, and I'm almost thinking our relationship was going to go to the next level of like, hey, we're going to be exclusive or whatever. And I just remember him just being like, I was like, what are we, the conversation, like, what are we doing? And he was just like, I don't know, Sheryl, I'm sorry. Like, my dad just said it would be a bad business idea to marry a Black girl. So, and what's really annoying about this particular person is that he dated other Black girls after me.
What?
Yes. Oh, yes. I was the first, but I saw him date other people. In fact, this happened to me several times where guys would date me and then I would see them date other Black women after. And I'd be like, what is going on?
I don't know how I feel about that.
And the thing is I would try to warn these girls, like, but we are so daggone desperate to be like everyone else and to be liked, right? There's nothing wrong with wanting to be liked.
True.
Right.
But then it's just like, it's just so frustrating because you see your Black guy friends like being, all the girls love Black guys. Like, they're just like, oh, I want to date a Black guy. I want to marry a Black guy, whatever, la, la, la. But as Black women, it just was not the same. So I found us like being pitted against each other, right? Like we started to fight over the 2 to 5 guys that dated all of us. And I saw relationships break up that shouldn't have broken up. And it was friendships of girls.
Yeah.
Because we were like trying to go after these guys, and it was dumb. Anyway, these are all just like different examples of just like how like dating was difficult, right? Like, you feel lonely, you hear these guys saying these things, or like I remember getting to a point where there were guys that would date me and I would just say to them, hey, do your parents know that you're dating someone who's Black? Or I remember this one guy, he was my friend and he was dating my friend who was Black. And I said to him, does your mom know that she's Black? And he was like, no, why would it matter? And I was like, go and tell your mom and then let's talk. 2 days later, he came back and was like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that my parents had certain sentiments. And I was like, listen, I learned the hard way where guys would say like, their dad or mom would say like, son, she's a really cool girl. She's a nice girl, but let's not make it anything more. You guys are different races, all these things. People are going to talk about it. And so BYU, like,
okay.
Hard, right?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to give just a slightly more context. So, Sheryl, what years were you at BYU as well? Because not showing your age anywhere or anything like that, just because
how old do I look?
No, you look very young, but I just want people to know because it's because in the 1970s, I think that's when the church stopped teaching it, or I don't know. I know in the 70s that's when they printed something about interracial dating.
Yeah.
When that was officially stopped, I don't 100% know. My knowledge on that stuff is not where it used to be.
So they didn't actually disavow those teachings until like the 2010s. I want to say it was like 2013 or 14, because I remember they read it at Genesis, and it was supposed to be this big deal that the church was like, we disavow teachings that interracial dating is not of God, something like that. But
I
yeah, it was
remember
into
that.
the
I
2010s.
know that's in the like race letter that they have that they came out in 2013 or
Hmm.
essay, but they used to teach it in the 70s. And so I say that to say, Sheryl, I'm pretty sure these kids' parents were being taught those things
Yes.
for when you were at BYU.
Right. So I went to BYU the first time from 2001 to 2004. Then I served a full-time mission from 04 to 06. And then I went from 06 to 07.
Yeah.
And then I went again to BYU in 2017 and 18, 19.
Okay. So kind of jumping into
17
that,
and
because also
19.
I want to say I relate 100% to everything you're saying about the dating and those feelings of loneliness. And I feel like people sometimes it can feel like that's like very trivial or something to minimize or not really mention. But I think it's important to mention out of BYU because in the church, that's such a big part of young adult experiences. Young adult experiences are built around meeting new people, dating, and getting married. So much of it
Absolutely.
is. It's like kind of ridiculous. Like they have FHE not just to have fun activities, but because they want young people to meet each other and get married.
Yep.
So much is built around that, and so many of the social activities are built around even just going on casual dates. And so Sheryl mentioning this is such a big part of a BYU experience because it's so embedded in the culture. And there are some people who are going out on dates every single day or they're going on dates every single weekend. And it seems small maybe to other people, but it really is like a very big part of the culture. And if you aren't participating in that, because I felt that way, you feel like you're eventually going to think something's wrong with you.
Yeah,
And
you feel like something's wrong with you. You think like you're ugly or like or the thing that really bothered me if I could go back to my BYU experience is I hung out and dated people that I actually didn't want to date or ever hang out with. But I was like almost like, well, sure, he's showing me attention. Like this would be cool, right? Like, and so it's just frustrating because my self-esteem was lowered so much that I just like found myself hanging out with people that I like would have never ever thought to hang out with if I was really like just like had options.
yep. And again, we could do a whole podcast episode on like bringing Black women on here and not just dating in the
Yeah.
church, but dating
This is
dating in
nationwide.
yes, well, just dating in white communities
Yes.
overall as a
Hmm.
Black woman. And I know other women of color also experience this. It's either you're a fetish, like you were saying, Sheryl, or people genuinely. I saw a TikTok one time where they, if you see stupid TikToks, they'll be like, "Oh, what do you rate this girl?" or whatever, dumb stuff. And this white guy was just like, "Oh, she's not my type." And the comments were like, "She's not your type? What do you mean by that?" Like, and because it was a Black woman that they were showing, and genuinely, like, people do not view Black women as attractive. They do not view them as beautiful. If anything, it's just more as like a sexual object, if anything. And that is rampant. I mean, that's tied to anti-Blackness again. That's a much bigger issue, but that is definitely prevalent in. You feel it more in extremely white communities like a BYU, like the church, because I've never felt more that way than when I try to force myself to date people in the white LDS church.
Can I say one more
Yeah,
thing,
go ahead,
Rachel?
add to it. Go ahead.
Because there's a couple of things that you said that like stick out to me. First of all, because my high school was predominantly white, I had this really kind of hard experience. Like, oh, sorry, I don't know if you could hear that thunder, but there was a big
Are you
thunder.
good?
So in high school, I ran track. I cheered. I was in the crowd that like got invited to parties and did all the things, right? But I didn't date. And I think for a long time it was easy because it was like, oh, I'm the LDS girl and I don't date until I'm 16. But I got to this like really weird point in high school where I won. It's not a homecoming queen, it's called an honor attendant. And basically I was a senior girl who was a princess of one of the clubs, and I got voted by my whole grade as like an honor attendant. And I was supposed to go to homecoming and I didn't have a date. And it was the next day. And I realized like no one's ever asked me to dances. I'd never been asked. And so this guy asked me in front of, like, I was cheering and he asked me over the gate, everyone started cheering. And I had to find a dress in like one day and figure it out. But it was like, I was just really used to like no one really thinking about me, right? So
Yeah.
I see what you're saying. It's in the white community, but I want to even stretch us even farther. When I got to BYU, I liked all guys. I've always liked all kinds of people, right? Like I mentioned that it wasn't like there was a line of Black guys waiting to date me. I would have happily done that too. But I saw Pacific Islander guys. I saw Latino guys. I saw Asian guys. I saw all these kinds of guys that would not date me. And I liked them. Okay. So I think a lot of times we think it's like white, Black only, but it's this anti-Blackness that you're talking about that, or this colorism that I feel like also needs to be talked about. And I can say that very boldly now that my husband happens to be Pacific Islander, which I never thought I'd marry a Pacific Islander person because I'd never experienced dating one or having successful relationships with a ton of Pacific Islander people, because at BYU, they generally kept to themselves.
Yeah. I'm hearing everything you're saying. Amen. Amen.
Anyway.
Yeah, no. That's what I say. We can do our own episode about this. We really should, Nate. I'm gonna put
I was
this
gonna say, I'll
on.
excuse myself.
No. We should, because this is a very real issue in the Black community that Black women deal with, and I've seen a lot of discord on TikTok and such about all of these issues, and I'm very passionate about it. But kind of, I want to go back to how you said you went back to BYU, because that's when I met Sheryl, was when she was back at BYU, and we got connected through another friend as well. Yes. But I want to talk about that experience, because I remember you telling me how different that was. And so what was it like going back? Kind of tell them why you went back and what was the difference in going back at a much older age with
despite the like kind of weird experiences I had in undergrad around dating, like I said, academically, I was like set. And BYU, like the name BYU, like Teach for America loved BYU students, right? Like they were like, oh, we have really successful rates with BYU people and all these things. So I felt like in the professional world, it benefited me. And I also left sipping the Kool-Aid and bleeding blue and going to any BYU game I could find around the nation that was like, you know, close to me. I remember going to the big BYU versus UVA game. And it was so just interesting because that was, again, it's not that I don't know that I'm Black, okay? Because I very much do know, but I remember being like, oh, look at all these BYU alum, and there are like no people of color here, right? It was there. I remember we even took a group shot of the Black folks that were at this game because it was just like a tiny group. We're like, guys, let's get together. Let's just take a picture. But anyway, I left BYU, loving BYU. Like even some of my students would talk about college, Miss Garner. Where'd you go to college? I'd say BYU. Maybe you could go there one day. Like, I told these kids like they could go to BYU. Anyway, I would not necessarily recommend that now. Anyway, so after I taught all those years, I recognized that I was like, you know, I think I really want to move forward with a school leadership certificate. I'd already had my master's from George Mason University, a university in Virginia, and I just needed a certificate to be a school principal. And BYU had this program where you could just, instead of getting a full another master's degree, which I didn't need to do, I could get my certificate to be a school principal. So that's how I found myself back there.
Okay, and what was it like when you were there as, you know, a grown woman, and now, because just talk about this.
So this is probably 10 years later, right? Because actually it was exactly. Because I graduated in 2007 and I started in 2017. So 10 years of life, 10 years of teaching in a more urban setting, inner city DC, having way more like Black friends, understanding where I aligned politically, understanding like just who I was as a person and just developing more. And I quickly learned that I was really concerned about who was going to be potential school leaders by the comments that were said in class. Now, remember, this is 2017. In 2017, this is still pre-2020. So I didn't have some of the language I had now, right? I didn't really talk about gaslighting, white supremacy, Black Lives Matter. I didn't talk about racial or even spiritual bypassing, all of those things. I didn't have that language, but I could feel it, right? Like I would write things in, I remember my philosophy education class, I had to write my feelings about certain things. And my professor was like, Sheryl, your writing's great, but I'm really concerned that you're really angry. And I wrote back and I was like, yes, because I am.
Yeah. You're correct. You gathered it correctly.
You gathered it correctly. I am angry. I am very frustrated that we are not diving deep enough to be school leaders for a country and a nation and a state that is growing to be more students of color, when the statistics show that most educators are 70% of the educators are white middle class females. And most of these kids that are coming through are starting to be multiracial or students of color. And I don't think we're really talking about what really is the like deeper rooted issues that we can really help all students, because we always say all students, but does all really mean all in education?
Right. So after this experience, like coming back and having this experience, did it change like your view on BYU? Just because, again, you said you were sipping the Kool-Aid and you were, feeling that way, and did it change? Just because I know you met people like Dr. Rue while you were here, and obviously different things you've been involved with more so, but how do you think that this like changed your perception of BYU, even with, even of the coming of the Black ministers and whatnot have happened?
Yeah, there were two things that happened that I just remember being like, oh, BYU is not, it's not set up for students of color, specifically, I'm going to just call it Black students.
Yes, call it what it is.
Yeah, to be like happy, strong, let's move forward to the next part of our life, enter to learn, go forth to serve, I think is the...
Yeah, no, that's it.
Okay. I didn't feel like BYU was set up for that way, because number one, yes, shout out to Dr. Jacob Rue, who talked to me forever in the parking lot once before a class. I was just so upset. I was like, I cannot believe I came back here. This is not set up for me to be successful. But he like helped me. And also another professor, Eric Bybee.
He's great.
He talked to me and just was like, anyway, I remember Eric Bybee and also another professor of mine that I had when I went back to BYU really encouraged me to go get a doctorate. And they, I don't know if Eric Bybee necessarily encouraged me to come back to BYU, but this other professor said, Sheryl, we need you to go get a doctorate. Go get either EDD education doctorate or a PhD and come back to BYU and teach. And I looked him dead in the eye and I said, Dr. So-and-so, BYU cannot support me as a student. Why do you think that it can support me as a faculty member?
Period.
I was hanging on by a string. And I want to try to be as specific as possible, because Nate did this like one segment of Black ministers, and I commented and I was trying to share like specific experiences. And there was one person who commented and said, like, I feel like no one's saying anything but trying to say something at the same time. So I'm really trying to be really specific to a person who's like, so really what was the problem? The problem is that a faculty, I couldn't find a faculty member that looked like me, first of all, that I could even just like talk to about some of this gaslighting that I was experiencing, being called angry and all these things. And it's like, yeah, but why am I angry? Like, really understand my sentiments, right? And so I feel like it just was not set up. And then it just made me sit there and I had a flood of memories. I went back to my time as a BYU student and I realized, okay, I was an athlete at one point at BYU. But it's interesting because I experienced two different worlds. the athlete world and the non-athlete world. As an athlete, you are just like, you're in a whole other world. You will leave BYU feeling great, 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 because you are taken care of. But if you're not an athlete and someone will look you dead in the face and just say, like, what sport do you do here? As if that's the only reason you could have gotten there, right? Or you are just like, again, I explained these dating situations, or I explained that I had people, like, I would walk and people would just like touch my hair. I remember my freshman year, a girl in my hall said to me, you know, you are the first Black person I've ever met. I'm in my mind thinking, I cannot recall the first time I met a white person. I could not tell you that story, but you can tell me I'm the first Black person you've ever met. And so here I am 10 years later, and I was like, this place is not equipped. And just because we are of the same like religious mindset, maybe I'm not
heavy on the maybe. Heavy on the maybe.
Yeah.
Sorry, but go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I just felt like very, 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 very different. And so that was a huge experience, realizing that I could not come back as a faculty member because I didn't feel safe as a student. The second thing, and Rachel, you probably remember this story, but I was asked, and this is before I think I started my program, but I moved back to Utah. Someone found out that I was a Teach for America alum living in Utah, and they had me come and speak at the Women of Color Club. And I was being very, very vulnerable, but it was a really, looking back, this shouldn't have happened, but I was supposed to speak to all these people who were going to be educators, and I was supposed to talk to women of color, the experience of being a woman of color at BYU.
At the same event.
Shouldn't have been the same event. Yeah. It shouldn't have been the same event because I should have talked to the educators in that education lens and then these women, but I did my best.
And it was a tough situation. It was like sponsored through Teach for America. It was a whole mess. I remember this because I was there. So
yes. Yeah, and I just feel like I was set up, but I just remember I'm like, okay, what could I tell these women? You know, maybe some of them are feeling really lonely, that dating experience. Maybe some of them are not sure what they want to pursue academically. And I'm just trying to be super positive and let them know there is a world after BYU. And if marriage or even staying in this faith is part of your trajectory, if that's what you want to do, you can do it. It does get difficult, but you can if you want to, right? And I remember showing my wedding picture, which that was a very like personal thing, right?
Yeah.
I show my picture and I remember there is a Black student right in front of me, like 2 feet. No, she wasn't that close, but I could hear her because she was so close. And she goes, she ain't really Black. Look at her bridesmaids. And and just so you know, my bridesmaids were predominantly white. I had some family members. I had an Asian bridesmaid, but the rest were white. And I had a lot of bridesmaids because I got married at 33. Like I've been a bridesmaid, I think 15 times by the time I got married.
Right.
Like, so it's like all these people, I'm like, hey, you want to be in my wedding? You want to be in mine? I was in yours, you know, that kind of thing. And I remembered at that moment, I was like, BYU isn't doing something right. Where as Black women, we are still not supporting each other the same way that I felt like we weren't supporting each other when I was there 10 years before. And that's a deeper rooted issue, I think, maybe beyond BYU, but because there was never a space to ever talk about anything, I just remember that moment and being like, that is not the kind of sisterhood that should be felt at this meeting. And I was really disappointed by that moment.
Yeah.
I can understand that. That's very frustrating.
And
one thing, okay. I'll be quick and then I'll let you. But one thing that kind of comes to mind for me, during my time at BYU, I was very angry, right? A lot of the time. Because of the lack of support that I felt, because of some of the experiences that I had with other students or with faculty members, the curriculum. I felt was very outdated, and there were a lot of things that I wanted to learn about that I never got the opportunity to.
Yeah.
And I felt like that anger kind of led me to feel, and because of the source of where that anger was coming from, like it was because of it was a predominantly white space, and I didn't feel safe in that space, and so it led me to kind of surround myself with other Black people, right? And then with that, you mentioned the comment that that woman made about, oh, she's not really Black. Look at her bridesmaids, and I guess the assumption there, or like the thing that she's inferring is like, oh, because the bridesmaids weren't all Black,
Right.
that means that, oh, you can't be a
Like I
white
didn't know
person.
who I was as a Black woman, or like I'm
Yeah,
not as Black, and yeah, all that. Yeah.
and I think part of the reason maybe for that, and I'm not justifying what she said, it's completely wrong. Um, but just thinking about my mindset, I think there's this kind of feeling that it's like, why are you associating with these people who are creating these problems for us at the university? You know what I mean? So it was like, and a lot of times at
Yeah.
BYU, if there was someone who didn't uh, associate as much with the Black population,
Yeah.
a lot of times they would work in an antagonistic way. I can think of
Mm-hmm.
a couple of people who I won't name any names, um, but they would actively speak out against things that the Black Student Union were doing, or
Mm.
they would hold beliefs and make sure they were publicly known that they felt this way, and they would kind of become someone that was damaging to Black people because something would happen, and then a racist incident would occur, and then this person would be like, oh well, I don't think it's a big deal because this and this and this, and I'm Black and you can listen to me, and it kind of created this divide.
Yeah. Definitely.
And
Yeah.
so I'm thinking that that's probably some of what she was feeling, was this, oh well, this person
Mm-hmm.
is not, that I don't know them, and based off of what I can see, this is how I'm feeling. And it's frustrating because, again, that's another way in which the university is failing to create safe spaces, and it's just creating further divides and further lack of cohesion, I guess, amongst the students.
Yeah, and this is something that I think as Black people, like I feel like we have got to work on radically loving ourselves, so that whoever our friend marries or whatever their friend group looks like, they can step in with their Black brothers and sisters, or Black siblings, I should say, right? And be like, we're good. And because this dividing situation, like, bothers me so much, like, because those voices that you're talking about, Nate, like, specifically, I've seen white people love to quote these people,
Mm-hmm.
and as if they are like how most Black people feel and think,
Yeah.
and it really makes it so that our experiences are just like put aside, um
Mm-hmm.
it's really frustrating. Yeah, I mentioned the one person's comment. It wasn't really, because like I've been told, because I did grow up in a predominantly white school, like many times in my life, oh, you're not Black enough, like, or you talk like a white girl, or I remember the church. I don't know. You guys are a little young for this, but maybe the church did these campaigns. It's called I'm a Mormon.
I know
Yeah.
those.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
We,
So,
I
my
watched
youth
all of
group
them
did
on my
our own
mission.
versions. Yeah, we did
okay.
our own versions. We made our own for an activity one time. So
Oh, okay. So I don't know if you know this. The church did one on me as a school teacher.
yes, I've seen it.
Okay.
I,
Yeah.
I think I
And
remember that actually.
yeah. So, this is when like YouTube, like, if you had like 100,000 like views, it was like, whoa,
Right.
But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, this is like where people just comment and comment under YouTube. And I remember
Mm-hmm.
someone was like, of course the church picked her. Listen to her. She sounds like a white girl. And so it's not that like I haven't heard these things all my life, right? Especially the school that I went to. I was the only Black girl on my cheering squad. So when we'd play schools that had a all Black cheer squad, like, I've heard it all. It was just more in that moment, I needed that radical love of ourselves as Black people,
Mm-hmm.
more than like hearing all those voices that I had heard in the past of like, you're not Black enough, right? And I think that needs to, that those are the kind of comments that I feel like need to stop,
Absolutely.
especially in a place like Utah with the highest transracial adoption population,
Yeah.
because you
Yes.
have these Black children being raised by white families predominantly, and then they come to a place like BYU where for someone like me, not very many Black students, but maybe to someone like them, this is a chance for them to actually have lots of Black friends.
Yeah.
And sometimes Black friends aren't as loving and welcoming to them because they're not Black enough. That kind of stuff is what I'm talking about. It needs to stop, because people's experiences are very different, and how people grew up and who their friend groups, it's just different. So like I just feel like we just gotta love each other.
Yeah, I think this is an issue that's not just definitely more prevalent at BYU in certain ways, but this is an issue that affects like all like predominantly white like universities in particular, because that's
Yes.
my experience with this situation.
Oh,
Like,
okay,
I
okay.
didn't grow up with these type of situations because I grew up in Chicago where black people were black and there aren't black people that were raised around like majority white people. I never knew that until I came to
Oh,
BYU.
okay.
I didn't even know people who grew up in like my friends who grew up in the suburbs also lived in black suburbs in Chicago, in the even the suburbs of the city. So like I
Interesting.
wasn't privy to like this. I didn't really understand that I don't know. Like my closest experience was like growing up in the church, but that wasn't where I like lived. Like I still
Yeah.
saw myself, like you
Right.
were saying, Cheryl.
Yeah.
So, but this is common because there are a lot of black people whose parents, whether they be immigrants or just like black Americans, and they move them to all white communities. And these black children don't, even if they have a black family, they don't have opportunities to associate with like large black populations because that's what their parents want. They
Yep.
do it on purpose as like obviously some internalized racism and issues with their parents there, but it's just the reality. Like there's always a joke of like black girls raised in the suburbs on TikTok, and it like cracks me up because I don't relate to that, but I just think it's funny, the stuff they be saying. And so I say all this to say that this is, I think it's really hard because black people who are really in like a fight or flight mode in all white environments, such as a BYU, white people are triggering. White people are the people who have brought a lot of pain and
Yep.
problems. And so when we see people who we think are like-minded, right, or even associate in a similar experience, like, yeah, we're both black, so I know that you've experienced uncomfortable things too. I think, at least for me, when I've been like, what are you doing there, friend? Because how is this experience like not negative for you? Because it
Yeah.
was so negative for
Only
me.
for you.
It
Yeah.
was
And me
so
too.
bad for me.
Yeah.
Why? How are you surviving? Like
Yeah.
to me, that's the questions that run through other black people's minds in those particular situations. And so that's why I do think that like I also have the desire that this is something that can get better within our community, just because black people are not a monolith. Black
Right.
people are not the same, and there are not things that make you more or less a part of the community. But I think in environments like a BYU that make you be, you're on edge at all times,
Yep.
and trust is built amongst our people by very small actions, I feel like. And when people, do little actions that make you not build trust, it's hard to continue to reach out to them. Because I've met black people at BYU who, from the day I met them to when they left BYU, totally different people in terms
Oh,
of understanding who they are, where they were going to be, what they support, and how they interact with people. And I say that to say that sometimes people need time to, I'm not saying this is you, but I'm just speaking in general. People need time to evolve or to come into their own or whatever that may look like. There's just so many varying situations. And I think that black people are sometimes judgmental. I will say, like, me and my people, we are judgmental on what that looks like, because it feels like as a protection mechanism, like
yeah.
I am not going to get close to someone who's going to, especially someone like myself, if we're both black, I'm not going to get close to someone who's going to make me defend my black actions or
Absolutely.
why I don't f with this
This
person
person.
or why I don't mess with this or why I'm making this comment.
Right.
And
Mhm.
in my experience, I don't know about Nate, but I have met black people at BYU who have done that.
Yeah.
And that never rubs the right way. And so it's this hard, like, it's this like weird, like in between of like there needs to be grace and like understanding
Yeah.
for Black people come from so many different varying experiences, so many different walks of life, but also like these Black people, especially like a Black person like myself, I never grew up like my Black confusion came from the church, not from my family. And so, you know what I mean? If we take that out, I didn't have that experience. So when I'm meeting Black people like that, I'm like,
it's very confusing for you, right?
It's hard. It's hard for me to, and so it's like, I don't know. I think this is something that I think we're getting better at it though, personally. Like even in my time at BYU, I've seen progress in the way the Black community works together and the way there's different people from different backgrounds who feel included.
But I will say
it's a real thing, and
it is a real thing
though, as a people.
I'm just really, really grateful. Yes, I met Black people at BYU that I like clicked with or whatever. But my really good Black girlfriends really came after BYU in DC. And DC like changed me, right? Like being a teacher amongst kids who looked like me, that was necessary for me to evolve and grow as a person. And also my coworkers were Black. And it was the first time that they just loved me for me. Like they didn't care that I talked a certain way. They didn't care like that I was actually first generation Black American, right? Or I guess technically second generation. My mom comes, I don't know. Actually, I always forget those terms if I'm second or first generation. But you know, so my mom came here as a teenager, but it wasn't like, oh, she's not really Black or she's not really American, because I had really great Black girlfriends in my professional career who loved me as me, right? And it was there that I really evolved as a person, and just teaching kids who looked like me and wanting the best for kids who looked like me, like really changed my viewpoint of the world.
Yeah. As we wrap up, I want to ask a little bit more about that, like your experience in DC and how that was teaching in an environment like that. And because you were in inner DC, correct?
Yes, I was so I taught in PG County, Maryland, which is just, it's actually like the largest like Black suburban or area in the nation. Like Atlanta and PG County have really large Black populations. And then I taught in my turnaround school that I talked about in my intro was in DC public schools. Yes, like in Anacostia, if anyone knows that area.
Okay. So what was that like? Just, I mean, what made you want to go into teaching as well? Just because I want to make sure the listeners know why you know, going from communications and sociology to then wanting to go into teaching, and like what that experience was like teaching in DC, because teaching scares me. I'm so proud of teachers. I could never get up in front of 30 kids and tell them what to do.
Yeah, actually be afraid of teaching. It's very, very hard. But essentially when I served my LDS mission, I did recognize that I found that I was the happiest when I was teaching people. But when I came home, like I had this degree, like I was a broadcast journalist, like trajectory and everything. And I had this like really weird moment where I like broke down crying with the head of the department and being like, I don't love the news. I only love the gospel. It was really a lot. Okay. What I was really just saying is that I did not want to be a teacher. I didn't want to be a broadcast journalist anymore, that I wanted to do something else. Right. And I thought that I wanted to maybe teach church kids. We call it seminary. That was definitely not the route that I ended up going at all. But through sociology, I started to learn about all the institutional issues, right? And so I could pick so many things, but I also recognize I'm one person. I couldn't change everything, but I could make an impact on something. I also happened to graduate in 2007, which was the recession. So everyone always talks about how millennials, we've always gotten like the end of the stick, short end of the stick. It is so true. I graduated and there were like no jobs. I found myself in New York working at the Gap and nannying. And
Wow.
this was like a really big deal for me because I'm, my mom is an immigrant, my parents
Right.
are immigrants, and it's like I went to school, there's all this sacrifice made, and I'm working, like I don't have a job.
Yeah.
And so that's when my mom had reminded me that I told her about Teach for America, and she's like, "You love to teach," and I'm like, "Do I love kids like enough to teach like kids? I don't know." And so anyway, I end up applying, and it's awesome because my very first school was really, really close to the school that my brother went to when I was 3, and we moved from that area of
Oh
DC.
yeah. Oh yeah.
So I made almost like this full circle of like I
Wow.
moved from PG County to Richmond, Virginia, and then we moved back. And then I taught in DC public school. So it was really cool to be like, I teach here and I was born here, like all of you guys. So, yep.
Cool. So I know that teaching in DC and like Utah are very different places. And so I wanted to ask a little bit as well about what was that like transition like? I know you didn't teach in Utah, but still working with the school district here, like you're aware of things that are going on and how things work. And so what was one of the biggest differences you noticed just in like some of the issues between maybe like the schools that out there and here, and even touching on how like students of color are treated here specifically, just because I know that that's a very big issue here in Utah
It
for
is a really big
for K
issue.
through 12.
Yeah, for K-12. And I mean, we're even talking about higher ed, right?
Yeah.
Like there's issues. So much. I am actually working on a project to really address racism in Utah schools. Even though I live in Georgia, I left Utah, but I feel responsible still for things that are happening, actions that are happening to students of color, namely Black students in Utah schools. And a lot of these actions are being done by kids of my faith. And so, like, I feel like a double-edged sword in this. But just to answer your question, Rachel, so teaching in PG County, Maryland, and teaching in DC opened my eyes that there's a world of teachers that can look like Black kids. Um, from my kindergarten through higher ed, I only had 2 Black teachers, my second grade teacher and my high school chemistry teacher. So no one in college. And so when I could like really look like my kids and really celebrate them and honor them and all of these things, that was so important. And that was kind of hard about going to Utah, right? Because you have these really great teachers that are really doing the best that they can, but most of them are white, teaching, at least the schools that I worked with, a lot of students of color, and there would just be that disconnect. And that was hard. That was hard. And that's why family engagement was so important to me, where I was like, schools, we have to recognize we've got to connect with these families, because whether or not English is their first language, maybe their race is different than you, a lot of these families are feeling barriers to entering in the schools and advocating for their kids because they don't know teacher talk. They don't know teacher language, and they want to be there for their kids. But as soon as they step in the door,
Right.
they feel like a barrier. I remember, like, I would do this thing, and I know this is a little bit snarky, but it's fine. When I would visit schools, I, was from the State Board of Education, but one way you can really tell a lot about a school is how the front desk treats you. And so I would go into schools and I'd say, "Hi, I'm looking for the principal." And it would be interesting sometimes that front desk people would not talk to me for a long time. I'd be waiting. Some were nice, some were very, very short with me. And then when they would find out I was from the State Board of Education, they'd be like, oh, So I was like, from the get-go, these are what families are seeing.
Right.
So if you are not a welcoming environment, just think like you as a school think these parents don't care about their kids. They care about their kids, but if they come to the school and the school's not welcoming,
and they already have other barriers. Like, let's say English isn't their first language. Just like I know a lot of
Yeah.
Title I schools in Utah have a very high immigrant population,
Right.
and so if that's already hard enough, no matter where you're at, and then they're greeted by that, and it's not a good combination. And yeah, so I can only imagine. Wow.
Yeah, so it was really great for me as an educator to be able to teach in schools that where my kids looked like me, and they needed it, I needed it. So it's interesting now being a parent and picking schools for my kids and just trying to figure out like housing. And I think the data shows us that 70% of kids go to public schools, and public schools are based on geography,
Yeah.
and geography is based on socioeconomic statuses. And socioeconomically, generally people look very similar in areas that they live. So that's why schools feel very segregated still, right?
Mm.
And so if I'm a person who really wants a good school for my kid, we've equated good schools with white schools.
Yep.
And that's very frustrating for me because I, just like anyone else, I'm paying my bills, I'm working, I'm doing all the things as, you know, as a family that we want to do. But it's really frustrating that the school that my kid is zoned for is 7% Black, and it's 14% Asian, and then 77% white. And coming from Utah, that seems like a lot, but it doesn't feel like a lot when I go to the school. But then what happens at the middle school? It almost becomes 50% students of color, which I love, but a lot of the white families send their kids to private schools. So
Wow.
there's this like, I mean, we could do a whole segment on what's happening in education, but if I could just say this, one thing that I am really, really concerned about is we see these parental rights parent groups popping up, and in theory, it sounds great. Like, I'm a parent and I want to have my voice heard. But if you really look at their missions, it's not really about like
Yep.
what's best for their kids. If they really understood diversity is good for all kids should be around all kinds of kids, kids who are English learners, kids who are a different race than them. Diversity really strengthens kids. Learning different languages strengthens kids. But what's happening with these parental rights groups, they're really trying to move kids away from anything that's different than their kid.
Mm. And we've seen that here in Utah too. So
Oh yeah.
it's definitely on the rise, and it's there. It's just, I don't know. To me, it's just like white supremacy at its finest, because it's also like very privileged white people who are part of these groups, as well. You know, like these are
And
not
from
people of color coalition.
all spectrums politically, right? Because as someone who's a left-leaning person, very, very liberal white families are equally like finding ways to remove their kids. And it's just like this is politically across the spectrum. I definitely see that the conservative side is being a lot louder and a lot ruder about it, but it is happening across the spectrum politically.
Yeah. That's very true.
Well, good luck to the future of us, and I can't imagine how it would be if I have kids, and how crazy things could be in however many years that is. So
take your time.
I will. Don't worry.
Yeah, take your time, and like also being a parent's like really hard. I feel like no one really told me, but like everyone just talked about the glamorous side of it, and there are so many beautiful sides of it. But like, I want to share just something that my friend wrote to me. She's a white girlfriend of mine, for those who want to know.
Sure, you're playing too much right now. Why are you playing?
I know. I'm just saying because I'm just being funny. But anyway, she and I were talking. So my world right now is like, what school do I send my kid for, even preschool? Like, right? Like, is it easier to send him around the corner? Because yes, it's easier. Or do I send him down the road where he's going to have teachers that look like him and things are more diverse or whatever? Right. And she just, she said something that I thought was really interesting. She's just like, it feels frustrating and flat out unfair that families of color have to so meticulously weigh these things out. Meanwhile, white people can show up basically anywhere with their mullets and corn nuts ready to party without a care in the world.
I'm crying.
Not the corn nuts.
Right, not the corn nuts and the mullets.
But
Oh,
it's true. Like as people of color, we have so much to weigh when we're thinking about education for our kids. Like, will the teachers look like our kids? Will they celebrate and honor our kids? Do they care about honoring all kinds of people? Right? What's the curriculum like? Are they really teaching correct history? There's so much to think about that some families don't even think twice about.
You're correct.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, I think it's a shame. And you mentioned like even the worry that you have to worry that they're being taught history that's correct and not a version of history that is damaging, right? Because a lot of the things that we learn could actually be like damaging to our image as Black people, damaging to self-esteem, things like that. And it's important to see yourself reflected not only in your teachers but also in the things that you're being taught, because a lot of people would have it just be like that history is taught about one specific group of people and one specific idea, manifest destiny, all of that, without teaching the other side of things. That there were people of color who had made significant contributions to society, inventions, and all those kinds of things. And yeah, all of those things are super important to weigh. And then when you have to think about that, and then on top of that, you got to add in your appearance and how your child will be perceived and all of these things. It's just a lot to worry about.
It is a lot to worry about. And because my first child is a boy, we know that the data shows that Black boys and boys of color are referred for, detention, those kinds of things more, for doing the same things as their white counterparts. And so I had these things to think about. But one thing that we don't look at historically that we need to really recognize is that we lost a lot of Black teachers when the Brown versus Board of Education was passed. When people think of that history, they always want to celebrate it because they're like, oh, segregation was over. And if you really look at what the Black families were trying to go for, they weren't saying like they weren't happy with their schools. They had great teachers. They were very happy. They just wanted the option to choose where their kids get to go, because sometimes their neighborhood school had not as good facilities or not as good books and all of these things. And so when Brown versus Board was passed, what actually happened is that you would have white principals keep their white staff. And so we lost a lot of Black educators during that time. And why that's huge is what they would do is they would bus kids. Do you remember that? Like busing started happening, but they didn't bus teachers. So then you have all these Black kids being moved to better schools, but no teachers that looked like them.
Right.
And so now what happens today? A person like me, who's like, oh, I'm thinking about being a teacher. Teaching is not seen as a profession that people are running to, that they're wanting to like become, right? In your words, I'm kind of scared of teaching. I'm like, you should be, but it's hard. You don't get paid as much as you should be. It's not seen as this like high achieving profession when it should be. If we actually like looked at what we should value our these little lives that are coming up and how much they should mean to us, we would put so much value into education, and that people would want to become teachers. But one of the reasons why our demographic is 70% white women is because it's really hard to raise a family being an educator. So a lot of times these white women, they're actually the supplement income to their family.
Yeah.
So if you are a single person, it can kind of work. But once you get like married and have kids, it can be really, really, really challenging to
financially support your family.
Exactly. And so that's why you're not seeing as many people of color, if we're finishing school, we're like, okay, well, we've got to make money.
Yeah,
so we're not running to education.
Yeah,
and it's unfortunately really sad.
A lot of me and my friends like, well, I need to make money, so that would never be on. Like, I love social work. I think it's a great profession. I would love to be a social worker if I can make more money. I don't want to do therapy. Because like the other ways I would be a social worker are like the lower end of like the spectrum of how much they get paid. And I literally told myself I'm not doing that because I want to make more money.
Right.
So you know what I mean? Like, and it's sad, but that's with not just with teaching, which I'm 100% on this train with you, but it's also with a lot of professions that do hard work, important work that are not compensated fairly, nor valued in the way they should in this society. But
and then parents are throwing daggers at you, your principal's throwing daggers at you, the district's throwing daggers at you, and you're just like, I'm just trying to teach kids, right? And so I will always be one of those people, because I know there are really burned out teachers. I know there are teachers that seemingly don't care about kids anymore. I will always say that people start out in education really caring for kids, and they're not tired, but I think they get to a point where they're just like, I'm just going to do the bare minimum because they feel so exhausted by all these different daggers being thrown at them. Not everybody, but a lot. So when you see these teachers that seem burned out, it's because they really are.
And I would guess that a lot of times it's probably hard to care or to feel like you care if you know that nobody cares about you. And the way that the education system is pretty evident that nobody cares about teachers the way that they should. And that can be very tiring if you're trying to do everything that you can to make, your classroom the best possible place for your students. And if you're just being bombarded on all sides by people who don't care, who don't appreciate the things that you're doing, I'm sure that like eventually will just take it right out of you.
Yeah. I mean, really, I ended up not becoming an administrator, even though I got my license to be a school principal, because I ended up choosing, no, you can't come in right now, sweetie. I essentially had to choose between like becoming a parent, or being an administrator. And I know a lot of people who are administrators and their parents, but one thing that I wanted to do radically different that a lot of Black parents don't always are able to do is to stay at home with my kids and volunteer and be able to do things that some of the things that my mom wasn't able to do. She was always very involved in the best way that she could, but she had to work. And so I had this opportunity to be there and be super present with my kids. And so I'm going to do it for as long as I'm able to do that.
Love that. Respect.
Oh. Okay, well, this has been an awesome interview. I've loved every second, and now it's getting me on my education train because I very passionate about education. I wanted to work in higher ed at one point, and that passion went to die when I saw the salaries. But maybe they'll come back one day. I can see myself doing it later in life when I build up that 401k and my Roth IRA.
Another question for you, Sheryl. So just kind of talk about like why it was that you moved from Utah to where you are now in, I believe, Atlanta.
Yes, I live in Metro Atlanta.
Okay, yeah. Tell us why the move.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I've been gone now for a year, but I started to recognize small things that were happening around me, specifically with my kids, that I was like, we've got to figure out what this looks like down the road for them and if we're going to stay here. We'd be at the playground, and at this time, I had, a 2.5-year-old and my other baby, and I would see kids running away from my oldest. And I was like, he's 2.5 years old. And kids were just like, he's so different than them. They didn't know what to do. And it kind of took me back to an experience I had at church where this little girl, she's really sweet, nice little girl, like maybe 4 years old. She comes up to me after a part of our church called Sacrament Meeting, and was like, "Why is your skin dirty?" And I was like, "Oh, well, I'll teach her about melanin and I will help this little girl understand." And I like thought I had this perfect answer. And the next week she came back to me and she's like, "Why is your skin dirty?" And I just remember feeling like she's 4 years old, but I felt like I was here. And I'm a grown woman who has words and who has the language to talk to her, and I felt less than her. And I recognized that she equated dirty, being Black, with being dirty. And that was not okay with me. And then I realized that was not okay with me, that my son would be experiencing these things just by living. And the third thing that kind of happened is working at the State Board of Education. I had my ear to things that were happening around the state when it came to racism. I worked next to the civil rights person. I also got messages from people who saw me as a trusted adult. Like, these things were happening, and it did not matter where it was in the state. It could be from Southern Utah to Northern Utah, wherever. If there was a Black student at the school, they experienced some form of racism. Sometimes it made it to the state level. Sometimes it only made it to the principal. Sometimes it made it to the district. But it was very common, too common, for a child who was Black to be called the N-word by the time they were 5. And I just kind of had to sit with this and be like, okay, I know too much. I know too much.
Yeah.
It doesn't even matter that I can go to the school and I can advocate. It doesn't matter that I know this district's principal or this district superintendent or whatever. I had my ears and hands in all the schools and all these things. It didn't matter. I could not necessarily protect my child from experiencing these like overt racist experiences as early as 5 years old, as early as I was seeing it on the playground. And we just decided, where could we go where my kids, like, without us even trying, we could have Black doctors, Black teachers, Black politicians, that they see themselves in places of leadership. And also, like, I recognize that my friends who were white, even though they loved me and they supported me and all these things, their kids weren't going to be experiencing these things.
Yep.
So we just made a decision, like, thankfully my husband's career was kind of plateauing in Utah anyway, and he was able to make a great move to Atlanta.
Valid reasons. These are many reasons why. I mean, like, I say this all the time. Like, I wouldn't live in Utah and raise kids here, Black children, for the reasons that you said. Yeah, and things you haven't said, but I 100% understand based on my experience with the state of Utah.
Yeah, because Matt and I always say, like, if it was just us, because I dealt with infertility for years and growing our family came in all different kinds of ways. But we always said, if it was just us, we could hang. Like, we know who we could hang out with. We know how this could work, right? And all of the things. But we just felt like, yeah, Utah isn't going to work. And then also our decision, to also stay active members of our faith played a big part of it, because people could say, like, okay, but your husband's Polynesian. Could you have gone to a Polynesian ward? And I'm like, okay, so we've gone, and I wasn't very welcomed. So that was a whole other thing. And, I've had Black friends who have gone to Polynesian wards, and I'm like, yeah, but you were with another Black person, like you were married to a Black person. And so they were very inviting, but it wasn't my experience being married to a Polynesian man as feeling as welcome. And my husband saw things that even I didn't see, where he was like, we will no longer be going to a Polynesian ward. So it wasn't just about like safety in the schools, like in church wise, like it just felt like the diversity wouldn't be there for us in Utah.
That makes sense. Yeah, Utah, it's changing, but it's still not where it needs to be, especially when it comes to matters of diversity. And there's just an interesting population of people here. But so with that being said, with you making your move, how has your paradigm of the church changed over time? Like from growing up to when you first went to BYU to when you went back to BYU did the second time to getting married, like all of those things. How would you say that your perspective on the church has changed, and how do you balance like the nuances of your experience as a Black woman in the church?
Ooh.
and having a Black family. I mean, like a mixed race family as well, but like your kids are also, they're going to be perceived as Black as well. And so how do you, like, that's part of this as well, I know, for you.
Yeah, there's a lot to this question. So first, I will say that my faith journey has been one that's been like full of like surprises for me, because I just always saw myself being an active member of my faith. And I think that's because when I was a young child, we went to like a lot of churches. And when I was 10, the LDS faith came into my life, and it just felt like very, very quickly that it was a good space for me, even though the girls, we kind of joked about this down the road, but it wasn't funny then. But I was 10 when I became LDS, and the girls in my faith, in my ward, weren't that welcoming to me. One told me later, she's like, you were receiving a lot of attention. I was used to getting attention. And, like, we're 10 years old.
Wow, so you're a hater.
Yeah. But it was like, for everything that like people say, like, they felt so much warmth and love with the church. I didn't quite have that experience. My like faith conversion came from like what I felt from other things, not necessarily my friend group. But through the years, things got really complicated, right? Because again, we've talked about, as members of this particular religion, or any like high demanding religion, I think, getting married is like a big part of that. And I didn't get married until I was 33. And that's older for the faith. And staying active was really, really got challenging in a way where, like, I dated a Jewish guy that I really loved. I dated a Catholic guy that I really loved. And it's just like all these other guys that like loved me. But I really wanted to stay in this faith. So I was like, no, this is what I'm going to do. But it definitely got really challenging to stay active. And what was the other part that you asked, Nate?
The other part was just how do you kind of balance the nuances of like racism and sexism and just being a Black woman in the church. How do you balance all of those with your faith?
Yeah, so I don't know. I feel like I tell answers with stories.
That's okay. That's what we like. Okay.
So something actually happened to me recently. So in my current ward, so I thought I was moving to Atlanta to be around like so much like Black diaspora and like all these things, and we landed in a pretty white pocket of the Metro Atlanta, because we had to go where we could afford, and we were looking for schools, and we already talked about schools stuff earlier. And so the way the church works is like you go geographically where you live. And so when I first came to this ward, there were actually a few Black families, and I was like, okay, it's not the most robust, but like it is what it is. But like in the course of the year, like they all moved.
Wow.
Okay, like So I went, like, I blinked, and now we're like the only like family of color that's actively going. And there's some like there's a Latina woman, like there's a few other sprinkles, but like really like Black families, like it's us, right? And so I was called to be the ward service leader, and we are doing service in my particular ward around Juneteenth, September 11th, and Martin Luther King Day. And I jokingly say that my bishop made this calling up for me, because after Martin Luther King, like around Martin Luther King Day, I was like, we live in Atlanta, and I never once heard about Martin Luther King like the Sunday before.
Really?
Like, what in the world? Like, his church and where he's born is like 20 minutes down the road. Like, what's going on? And he's like, yeah, we need to do better. And so he like thought about it, and he's like, let's do service around these days. Cool. So I'm like, okay, if we're going to do service around Juneteenth, I'm going to have our predominantly white ward go and do service. And I found a historically Black cemetery that we could clean up, that had been forgotten about, that needed work. And this cemetery existed because, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, these Black people could not be buried in white spaces.
Yeah.
So anyway, it wasn't lost on me that I was a Black woman that led a predominantly white congregation to clean up a Black cemetery. And it was powerful because I didn't know how many people would show up, but 115 people showed up.
Wow, and that's pretty good.
Yeah, it was great. I thought 45 people were going to show up. And so I had traditional foods that you find at a Juneteenth celebration: red velvet cupcakes, watermelon, strawberry soda, things that are red, because red signifies ingenuity and all these things. And I was like, this is a good like moment, but I was like, oh no, we're not going to have enough food when all these people showed up. But it was great. But someone came up to me instead right before we had the refreshments or whatever. They're like, yeah, my son said that Miss Sheryl said that we were going to be having Black people food. And I was like, what? I didn't say that. I said we were going to have foods that are traditionally Juneteenth, foods that you find at a Juneteenth celebration. And then he jokingly, I thought it would be funny. He was like, and then I saw that you guys had watermelon, and I was like, come on, Sheryl, you're really going to give into this like stereotypical watermelon food thing? And I was like,
cringe.
So I'm like, how do I sit with this, right? Because like I have to keep going and do all these things. And I'm like, this guy's my age, a little bit younger than me. So this isn't just older people doing these things, right? These are younger people too. And I'm just like, are you kidding me? So I did two things. One thing, I sent him the history about watermelon and why there are Black folks today who feel uncomfortable eating watermelon in front of white folks. And it has to do with the fact that after slavery ended, there are Black folks who started to grow watermelon. This was a crop that they could grow and that they could make money off of. But former white enslavers were like, they're like anti-race or anti like, or their white supremacy, like, through the roof. They're just like, oh, we're going to like make fun of these Black folks eating watermelon. So watermelon was shown as being sloppy and lazy. There'd be pictures of just like Black people eating watermelon and like it's very sloppy and all these things. And I was like, this is the history with watermelon. Okay. So like when you said that, like I'm not comfortable with that because these are the stereotypical pieces. Second of all, food is racialized, and you've continued to help me to understand that and where the problems come with that. And number three, everyone likes watermelon. Why couldn't you have just said, we all eat watermelon? Miss Sheryl's not having just Black people food. We all love watermelon. That was a teachable moment that you could have had with your kid that you didn't have, Right. And so I was just really, 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 really frustrated. But I think the thing that frustrated me the most is that I mentioned it in our little ward council. I was like, hey, this is something that happened to me. one good friend of mine that's in that ward council like gasped. She was like, what? Like, kind of like, that shouldn't have happened. But no one else said anything. The white silence happened. The let's move on, like, I'm uncomfortable, but 115 people showed up. Isn't that great? And I just felt really, really alone. And what ended up happening is today I didn't go to my ward. Today I went to a ward that I knew was more diverse, that was more in the city of Atlanta, where I just like wouldn't feel so frustrated. So Nate, that's a very long answer for saying like my journey is still long because I need church to be a space where I can like relax and like just feel a spirit of God, that a relationship that I'm still working on with God, period. A relationship with Christ, a relationship that I'm just still working on, period. And when I'm not feeling like this, like support from leadership, like that just makes me feel confused. And I know people who a lot of my friends who are like, I'm done. And I get it. When people tell me they're done, I'm always like, I get it. Like what you're saying it's not like it's not true. It's true.
Yeah, right.
So it's just a journey for me. But when I look around as a Black member, as a Black woman, I recognize that this is my faith tradition. This is what I've known the longest. This is what I'm comfortable with. This is where I feel like I feel the happiest. But it's not that I don't believe that I can't find truth other places or all of that. It's just that I feel like I want to be here and I'm trying to be here, but I just don't know what it's going to, like, you could talk to me in a few years and it may be different. I don't know.
That makes sense. So with that, just to kind of, I guess, sum everything up, if you could give advice to all the young Black girls that are growing up as members of the church right now, what advice would you give them, or what would you want for them as young Black women in the church?
I want young Black women, especially that I have 2 girls that I'm raising as well. And I recognize that my kids' experiences will be very different. I have a son whose skin tone is different than his second sister, whose skin tone is different than, or his sister, and then my baby's skin tone is different, right? So I feel like my kids' experiences will be very different, from gender to race, all the things. I just want my kids to feel peace. That's what I want for them. If they're not feeling peace, then I want them to find that peace wherever that is. And I'm even trying to look for this in my life, and I'm making lots of decisions for my kids, and I'm like, what brings me the most peace? And that's what I want for these girls growing up. I actually think that I still feel really sad when I find out more Black members of the faith leave, specifically in the United States, because the church is growing in the Caribbean and Africa. And I know why, because I've served in 2 African countries. When you have leaders who look like you, it's a lot easier to stay. And I've seen a lot of African members come to the United States, and then you find that they'll like stop going because they're treated very different at church. It's almost like they don't know anything. And I'm like, he was like the bishop in this like ward back in, Zimbabwe or whatever. And you're treating him like it's like the first time he's ever come, right? Like, and so I can see the issues specifically with the church, with Black members in America. And so I just would want my kids and any child or any daughter, any woman to feel peace. And I'd hope that it'd be here. I still feel very sad when I find out that people are leaving, but again, I get why they are.
Love that.
Yep.
I think that's about as good of an answer as you could possibly give. Just feel
Agreed.
peace. Protect your peace. I love it. Well, I think Rachel, do you have any other questions?
No. Is there anything else you want to say, Cheryl, before we go and wrap this part up? Is there anything else you want to say to the world or share anything? You can let it all out.
I just think that Black Ministers is doing like really critical work. Like disrupt everything, like get people talking, get people moving. And I hope change is gonna come, but whew, it's so slow. So for you guys, pace yourselves, go to places that bring you peace because it's hard. Like, I don't want you to burn out. Like, you deserve to just live happy lives. And there are some people who are going to listen and change, and there are many people who are not. And that's just a reality.
True.
Amen.
We experienced it all,
Yeah.
sadly. So now we're gonna do our recommendations portion, Cheryl. We didn't share this with you, but we do recommendations at the end of every podcast, and these recommendations can be literally anything, like whatever you want, like a movie, a food, an activity. Nate, you want to go first this week? Something.
Yes, I'll go first.
Hey.
All right, so my recommendation for this week is to go on Amazon Prime Video and check out the TV show Jury Duty. I watched it this week, and it's like a comedy where basically the idea of it is like they're filming a documentary about being on a jury, and so they have like a whole court case, and there's like a jury selection process and all of that. But the thing is that only one person is a real person, and everybody else in the show is an actor. And so they're just kind of like setting up they're engineering these different situations to see how this person will react and like how far they can go. And like, just kind of like engineering the situation. It's really cool. It's really entertaining, really funny, and very heartwarming. So I watched that this week. Loved it. I watched it in a couple of days. So go check out Jury Duty. If you have Amazon Prime, like the 2-day shipping, then you also have Amazon Prime Video and it's free to you. So I recommend checking that out.
Yes. Okay, my recommendation for this week is also a show. I haven't recommended like TVs or movies in a long time, but my recommendation is to go watch, if you love reality TV, which I do. It's my guilty pleasure. I don't care. Go watch The Ultimatum. They just released like a queer one. I have been wanting to watch it, but I just had taken my time. And I finally watched it. So good. I just love watching other people's lives and having opinions on it. And my next, someone, don't take this from people, but help me develop this and we can split the profits. We need to make a platform where people can like live chat on episodes as like things are happening, so that you can see what other people are thinking. You know what I mean? Because you ever watching a show and you're like, I want to know what other people who are fans are thinking. Like, and it doesn't need to be live. Like, you can just add it as you watch it and see anyway. I love that kind of stuff. And so that's what I was thinking watching the whole show. It was very good. And I'm glad they did a queer one just to, highlight there's other sexualities other than straight people who are in relationships, which is what most reality TV shows are about. So that was also quite unique and innovative that they did that. So I'm excited for their next season because it's just very good and very messy. I love it.
Yeah, it is a messy show, and it is a guilty pleasure of mine too.
No, I love it so much,
Rachel. Okay, so my recommendation, if you have not read the book Born a Crime by Trevor Noah, I would recommend audiobooking it. I know there's some people who love just like a book in their hand or whatever, but Trevor Noah, if you don't know, he speaks like 9 of the 11 official languages of South Africa. And I served my full-time mission there. So I like really love South Africa for many reasons. But even if you know nothing about South Africa, you listening to his story is amazing. And because he can like go from Afrikaans to Xhosa to Zulu to Swana to Sotho, like he just can go into all these different languages and make you feel like you are there. But it also really talks about race relations in a very all-consuming way, where even if you never really thought about something because it didn't really impact you, you can be brought into his world. Because his mom is Xhosa and his dad is Swiss, and they have Trevor under apartheid, and that was illegal for him to be born at that time. So in that relationship, so I recommend specifically Born a Crime and audiobooking it.
Wow, wonderful. Well, good. I do like when authors audio like do their own recordings because it is cool to hear it like with their own intonation and whatnot.
Yes.
So that I'm gonna add that to my list. I have like 3
It's
credits
really good, and
right now.
it's quick. Like
Okay.
you'll kind of like not be able to put it down because he just gets you in, and it's quick. So
Okay.
Okay, I'll check that out for sure.
Well, that's all we have for this week. Thank you for the wonderful interview, Sheryl. I've loved having you on, and we will talk with you guys next week.